just caught a bit of his comments at Davos, which is clearly wrong. Donald Trump is some kind of secret agent for the BRICS. I am actually embarking on the early stages of developing what I'd call a new platform, which I'm going to call BRICS Plus Platform, which is essentially trying to help the world stop thinking it's us versus them.
Is President Trump scoring a massive own goal by bullying America's Western allies over Greenland? Trump says that the US wants a stronger West to counter China and Russia. Yet his coercion of allies is making them hedge their bets against US rather than Chinese hegemony. The Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, in a blunt message in Davos said that compliance with the bully will not guarantee safety. This comes just days after he called China a more predictable partner than the United States. Today I'm going to discuss the global realignment with Lord Jim O'Neill, a former British Treasury Minister. 20 years ago, he famously coined the term BRICS to describe the ascendancy of non-Western economic powerhouses: Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. They all happen to be in Donald Trump's hair.
So, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them.
The European Union was formed in order to screw the United States, but now I'm president.
Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage.
As global alignments begin to shift, new diplomatic paths are taking shape.
We choose fair trade over tariffs, a productive, long-term partnership over isolation.
China is welcome, but what we need is more Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe.
Our relationship has progressed in recent months with China. It is more predictable.
India is a partner of choice for Germany.
The EU-Mercosur agreement sends a powerful message. Welcome to the world's biggest market and largest free trade zone on the planet.
Best deal ever made. Thank you very much. They have BRICS, which is basically a group of countries that are anti the United States, and it's an attack on the dollar, and we're not going to let anybody attack the dollar.
As old certainties fade and new alignments emerge, Europe and countries around the world look outward, redefining their place in a changing global order.
Lord O'Neill, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. It's a great honor to join you. Thanks for having me.
So the first question is President Trump disrupting the West or maybe uniting it through disruption?
We don't know yet, but it seems like a bit of both. He certainly has an extremely audacious, disruptive style, which is on a whole different level than the first term of office that he enjoyed. He feels intriguingly emboldened. And I have to say pretty candidly that much of what he talks about, and highly topical of the day we're having this conversation, seemingly happily diminishing the role of soft power that America has led for the Western world since my birth and before it, since World War II, is really quite astonishing. However, I add straight away that there is some part of aspects, especially of how he thinks about the world, which are realistic and go back all the way to the 25-year day nearly, November this year, when I first coined the phrase BRICS, in that he realizes there are big important nations in the world that don't conform to the way the West hoped or believed, and still some think should be, namely China and Russia. And he also quite eager to mention India at times in this regard, so three of the BRICS. And he's realistic. My first ever paper was how we need to have a much more modern form of governance that somehow recognized not everybody wants to be the same. And I specifically suggested some kind of new form of G7 to include the four main BRICS, not South Africa because they're not big enough, and for the Europeans to get their act together and to really be represented by one. And so that part of Trump, going to your exact question, the disruptive to make things better, would be a great outcome if we finally got to it. But the style and contradictions in which he goes around this path, in addition to some of the substance, really raise doubts as to, other than him wanting to be the talking topic of every minute of conversation all over the world every day, I'm not quite sure what's really below the surface.
So what do you see as the biggest contradiction in what he is doing?
So let me take it at the extreme. When he presided over the release of the national security strategy in the latter part of last year, I guess it was late November, early December, alongside it there were some noises about something that his colleagues or his team were dubbing the C5, which Politico is the only organization I've seen that's really covered it, which would be an entity about 5 countries that he thinks are crucial to the modern world. And those the United States themselves, Japan, slightly oddly, China, Russia, and India. And that is quite realistic, apart from the fact it doesn't include the other BRIC, Brazil, and it doesn't have anybody or anything from Europe. And I sort of think that is closer to a reality than the broken form of global governance that we all kid ourselves is working fine. And now, again, on the day we're talking, is utterly shocked by it seemingly being ripped apart by the people that put it forward. Against that is, of course, he is assuming that the US economy is completely impervious. I just caught a bit of his comments at Davos, which is clearly wrong. The US depends on the kindness of strangers and massive foreign capital flows into the United States. And the flip side of that is an extremely weak domestic savings ratio. And the United States cannot afford to upset everybody around the world all the time, particularly if it makes investors think this guy is diminishing everything that the US has benefited from this system, which he clearly conveniently often ignores. And we are vulnerable to our safety of investments in the US. And we've seen a bit of a mini rerun of that in the markets the past 36 hours. And if that becomes a bigger repeat of what we saw on so-called Liberation Day last April, I think there'll be a lot of forces inside the United States saying enough of this guy, including possibly in the Republican Party, because all that will do is force the United States into a significant slowdown, probably recession, and accelerate the relative decline of the United States, which you wouldn't actually really accept, has been going on slowly for the past 25 years. Not as fast as the rather worrying decline relatively of Europe, but it is still the case. So the underlying economics to what Trump is saying just don't make any sense whatsoever.
Right. So you're basically saying he's overdoing it. But I just want to draw your attention on your comment. Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, who, like you, is a world economist, if you will, with policy-making experience. He delivered this stunningly political speech in Davos, effectively saying that, you know, the world middle powers, mostly Europe, but also the United Kingdom, they just need to hedge against US hegemony rather than against China, which in a sense is stunning because, as you rightly pointed out, Trump recognized that China may be the power to be reckoned with. And my question to you is he unwillingly pushing the Europeans, the Canadians and others towards China?
So I sometimes jokingly have thought, since he came back to power, that Donald Trump is some kind of secret agent for the BRICS, because as you had in your clip at the start, he actually talks about the BRICS more than any other Western leader I've ever seen, which, given I created it, is obviously I'm rather intrigued about. And so in that sense, yes, he is. As an aside, and a rather important, truly global thing, inadvertently, he has caused the Indian leader Modi to actually go to Beijing for the first time in 7 years. And of course, if those two countries seriously started to do things together, that would be transformational, even more for the whole of Asia's economic future and for any country that wanted to deal with them. Let me come specifically to Mark Carney's speech, which, frankly, I enormously admire. And I also admire the reality of his trip to China, because Mark is living in the real world. Because this is the 25th anniversary and because of the state of global governance, I am actually embarking on the early stages of developing what I'd call a new platform, which I'm going to call BRICS Plus platform, which is essentially trying to help the world stop thinking it's us versus them, and for the Western nations especially, to start thinking more seriously about the whole issue of values versus realism. And what are the values that we really, really, truly hold, rather than just talk about? And what are the realistic things we want to achieve in engaging with other places in the world, including ones that don't choose or have an ability to behave politically like we do? And Mark Carney, I jokingly said to one of my co-founders and some friends of mine that know Mark this morning, he's almost like an unofficial ambassador for what we're going to try and do, because he is so right. And people need to get real. And it goes right the way back to my original BRICS paper, is especially here in Europe, leaders of important countries and many people in and around the EU have got to get real. Economically, since 25 years ago, the European economies have declined, relatively speaking, because they've had very weak growth. And yet they still think they deserve the right to be represented individually at all these global tables. And Trump is also kind of pointing out that, well, you're not that economically important and you can't even really defend yourself, so why? And hopefully, and I think Poland often is a shining beacon of leadership on this, we have to get out of the conventional easiness and laziness around many Western nations and stop thinking like this. And what, for example, if we think there should be a truly effective single market in trade and services in the EU, let's get on and do it. Because if that was really done, the benefits to all EU member countries would vastly outweigh worrying every other day about how do you handle yet another idiotic threat of tariffs from Donald Trump.
Right.
So Europe needs to take more charge of its own destiny.
But now that you let it slip that you're working on something, can you elaborate a little bit more on this BRICS Plus framework? What are the values that you're talking about here?
Well, I guess at the essence, I mean, we're not even going to be alive until the spring, in all probabilities. But we're working on our mission statement and getting our advisory group together. But at the core of it are really three things. The first one is the long-term economic reality for the world is what I outlined or presided over with my colleagues way back 25 years ago about a vision of 2050, is that so-called emerging markets are in the process of becoming much bigger. Just yesterday, despite its many short-term cyclical problems, China's GDP showed it had now surpassed over $20 trillion at the end of 2025, an extra 1.3 trillion over the year before. That is more than creating one Italy in 1 year. It's effectively like creating two United Kingdoms in 1 year. And so even though many people bemoan and worry about China slowing, which was always going to be the case, they are continuing to rapidly become a bigger share of global GDP. India is enjoying growth of 8% of global growth. Indonesia, the largest populated new member of the BRICS Plus alliance, is arguably, outside of the BRICS, the most exciting dynamic economy also in Asia. And over the next 30 years, they are going to become a lot bigger share of global GDP. And that's the reality, whatever is the political flavor of the moment. The second thing to say, therefore,
carry on.
We have to stop in Western nations sort of thinking a little bit back to our colonial roots, let's call it. It's obviously a bit more subtle and complicated, of trying to tell all these countries that you have to use our human values in order for us to recognize and deal with you. And it's okay if those values that we adhere to are truly sincere and ones that we truly hold, but don't kid yourselves that these countries and those in the global south are just going to accept it when you don't stick to them, as we see with the endless contradictions with the various geopolitical wars that we've had so far this decade to date, because it's very shallow, and there are many other examples I could point out too. And it's really important that European leaders, individually and collectively, start being more honest with themselves about these kind of things. And then the third thing, it goes to the core of what all of our citizens, whether it's in Poland or the UK or across Europe and elsewhere, think. People want more prosperity and hope for the future and sharing in the economic cake, which means we have to grow the economic cake a lot more than we've done for at least 2, if not 3 decades in many European countries. And we need to find a better way of making those that suffer from some parts of globalization share in the benefits. Otherwise, it will continue to lead to further weakening of economic growth and further very strange things going on with our own political systems, as we see in so many European countries today.
So if I may ask, so who else is going to be a stakeholder in this initiative that you're going to reveal in spring?
It's far too early for me to start saying publicly things like that, but we are in the process of putting together a very stellar advisory board from many parts of the world, both BRICS and West, and we're going to be working to make sure we have substance on trying to influence policy with some of the best brains in the best universities and think tanks all over the world.
All right. So hopefully you will tell us when the time is right. You mentioned Britain.
I'll very, very happily come back to talk to you about that in the spring.
Fantastic. We have a deal then. And, you know, this is the era of a deal. So, but, you know, so speaking of Britain, because you mentioned Britain and the fact that UK is also effectively a much smaller player than it used to be in global affairs. Britain's position is awkward because it's been traditionally the closest ally of America in the West, but now it's coming under equal pressure as other European nations. Even his allies, you know, ideological allies, such as Nigel Farage of the Reform Party, they're balking. So the question is, now it's 10 years since Brexit, and Britain is particularly, as far as I can tell, suffering from this lack of growth, if you will. It's 10 years since Brexit. What is your assessment of the impact of it, and what should Britain be doing now to re-engage with Europe and the world?
I find myself wanting to answer you in the context of the shock of Donald Trump. Against the background is, frankly, the UK has been in some kind of fog ever since the decade now, since we opted to leave the EU, because most of the intellectual elite and the system was shocked by the outcome, knowing that it would be an economic negative, which obviously it has been, and it continues to be so. But what could have been the case, and a small part of me hoped, even though I was very disappointed by the outcome, that the shock of this would force the UK to do 2 or 3 things. first of all, would be truly, truly global because of our long history and our wonderful historic role of being such an outward-looking nation all over the world, and truly do things that are right for the UK, and not just based on what we thought some other country might want of us. And we've failed miserably on that so far. Secondly, that we would deal much more importantly with our own enormous geographic imbalances in terms of inequalities and unfairness, of which there are some signs of progress. And thirdly, that we would have elected leaders and a parliamentary system that would allow us to have some belief and underlying sustainable confidence about how we would navigate our way through this path. And maybe in a strange, hopeful way, the sort of outrageousness of what Donald Trump has been saying, including having a bit of a go at the UK each day so far this week, sort of shakes us up a bit from this sort of stupefied, sort of zombie thinking that we've had for a decade, because we desperately need it.
So Donald Trump again as a disruptor and catalyst of change.
He's definitely the first part. He is definitely the disruptor. And part of me, as I say, admires the appearance on the scene of somebody like this, who is at least, albeit rather bluntly and in some very occasionally nasty ways, pointing out to the sort of elite liberal status quo so many things that haven't been functioning for the benefits of the people that elect us. And we need to do something about it. But that isn't going to happen because of what the Donald Trumps of the world are saying. It requires very sensible and thoughtful policies from the people in all these different places.
But speaking of policies, do you think the UK should re-engage with Europe in a more meaningful way? I don't know, joining the single market again, doing the kind of Norway model, Give us your view of policies that the UK can take in the next, 5 years.
So I'm very glad you added the 5-year bit, because that goes over the period of the next general election. And contrary to how many other people are talking about it at the moment, my own view, for what it's worth, is even though the Labour Party that's governing the country seems to be in a bit of an internal mess, because of the size of their majority, and despite the chaos that's gone on here, excuse me, I don't believe it's likely that we'll have an election before then, because they have a big majority. But what I would quickly add is, if you look at the opinion polls about the topic of the EU, they have shifted now quite a lot. And more importantly, and maybe linked to why they are, if you look at the evidence and how the country's performing, it's pretty clear that we've either not handled it at all well, or we should have never have left. And it seems to me, and I'll make a prediction, that as part of their own campaign to be re-elected after the next election, the Labour government is, I think, quite likely to consider campaigning on rejoining the single markets in some form. Because at the end of the day, and this obviously relates directly to my own long-term background as an international economist, you cannot expect to leave a notional free trade zone of what is at least 50% of your trade and not expect there to be negative economic outcomes, especially when it's very closely geographic related to you.
Right.
International trade is driven by closeness of trade partners and the ease and competitiveness of access. And it's pretty straightforward. And obviously, the country is actually being led by a prime minister that was one of the most vocal campaigners for us staying in. And now, politically,
and now he's silent.
I think as the next few years go on, the appeal of rejoining partially will be quite high to them.
Right. We're slowly winding down our conversation. So for a moment, I just wanted to ask you to tell me, what is your opinion about how China is approaching all this turmoil, and to what extent it is either benefiting from it, geopolitically speaking, Or is it just watching from the sidelines and waiting until the West kills itself?
Well, you partially answered it with I guess that's your own judgment there. I think China will be going through two thoughts. First of all, the leadership will be thinking yet again, what is so wonderful about this supposed democracy that is something that many of these countries have just taken for granted we are going to choose or allow our people to force us to do. And I think that will be the dominant thought process that reinforces, rightly or wrongly, the self-confidence of the Communist Party leadership. As I said earlier, despite their own challenges, they just reported 5% GDP growth, and in US dollar terms, have just gone over $20 trillion. And across urban China, there are hundreds of millions of people that have the same GDP per capita as some of the most sophisticated parts of Europe. And that system has delivered that to them. And so the Chinese government is under absolutely no pressure internally for any kind of major change. Against that, I think they will have some concerns. First of all, I think they will be quite bothered about the ongoing lack of apparent strategic thinking of President Putin, frankly, in Russia, and the seemingly growing evidence of the challenges it is facing to the Russian economy, which struggles to grow anyhow. And with it, the risks to the leadership style system in Russia that China has been so sympathetic, at least superficially, to in recent years. And I wouldn't be surprised if behind the scenes the Chinese are getting quite concerned about that.
So how should Europe, of course, we have to finish now, but just if you could just give me a quick take on how should Europe handle China? How much engagement, how much economic exchange, and how much trying to build own resilience?
So my simple phrase for this is something I learned way back in my days of Goldman Sachs. I'd call it enlightened self-interest. And Mark Carney, as the leader of Canada, is showing great rationality, in my opinion, that he is thinking what is in the interest of his country with this very strange era of his southern powerful neighbor, and the remarkable economic importance of China to so many industries and businesses that are relevant to Canada. And that is exactly what every European leader should be thinking, in my opinion. And by the way, to their credit, the UK is sort of gingerly, through this sort of 10-year fog, still trying to pursue here, albeit very, very tentatively.
Lord O'Neill, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much for watching. This was On the Record, and see you next week.